Hello everybody, I'm Jack Dennis. I produced a lot of fly tying tapes on techniques, and in those tapes we've brushed on materials. But now we're going to take a more in-depth look at materials. I've invited my friend Scott Sanchez, a very innovative fly tyer. In fact, if you've seen the Dan Bailey catalog, you've seen some of Scott's patterns. He is a master of materials. In this tape, we're going to examine how to buy materials, what materials to select, what to look for to make sure you don't waste your money. Scott's here to guide you through the wonderful world of fly tying materials.
After that introduction, I better give you the double bunny I promised you, Jack.
Ooh, killer pattern. This is the pattern that won 3 of the Jackson Hole 1 flies, isn't it?
Yeah.
Innovative patterns. That's what Scott's been involved with. A lot of it is materials. That's what makes this fly, isn't it? The bunny fur.
Yep, this gives it the action in the water.
And you're going to guide us through what materials to select, what to look for when you buy materials. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Scott.
It's tool time with lots of power. Actually, we've got all our basic fly tying tools here. I'll show you some of the examples of fly tying tools that are common on the market. So when you go in there looking for that fly tying device at your local shop, you'll know what to get. The original vise, and probably one of the most common in the industry, is the Thompson A. Good, simple vise. Durable, you can get replacement jaws for it. In fact, this is Jack Dennis's original fly tying vise, this exact one here, which is 30+ years old. You can get these extra jaws for smaller flies or larger flies, or if you happen to wear out a jaw. It's fairly inexpensive. A very common and very popular vise in the market is the Regal. Real nice and simple. No hook adjustment. Press the cam, slip on the hook, and away you go. It comes in a fixed head model, or there's 360-degree model, which you can turn around for trimming your fly or inspecting your fly. A vise that's got a lot of the market share in recent years is the Renzetti. It comes in a few different versions, but basically the attributes of Renzetti, it's a true rotary vise. Once you put your hook in there, when you turn the vise, the hook's always in plane. It's always in the same line. You get a basic model like this called the Traveler. This is a bobbin cradle for throwing your thread over, just in case you wrap materials with the vise. You get deluxe models like this with a heavier jaw and a cam adjustment on it, like the Master, one of the highest end vices on the market. Some simple vices are the Griffin vices. They're pretty good value for beginning fly tyers, especially this one here, the Model 1A. Real simple, turn the knob here, close it here, hold a wide range of hook sizes, and it says it's a very economical vise for beginning tyer. On the top of the Griffin line, you have the Patriot Cam. This is kind of a neat vise. It's a 360 vise. Has an adjustment here, but one quick close of the cam secures it real quickly and very, very securely. This one here is on a pedestal, and sometimes look at pedestal versus C-clamp vices. My general preference is to use a C-clamp like there's on the rest of the vices. It's just more secure. But if your tying area has a table that's too thick or you travel a lot, we don't always have a good tying area, a good heavy pedestal like this will work. This particular vise comes with a 2-piece stem, which you can screw together. On these other vices here, if you use them in a pedestal, it's not a bad idea to get a shorter stem. It will make it a lot more steady platform. After our vices, the next most important thing is going to be a good pair of scissors. A good sharp pair of scissors will allow you to trim out hackle fibers. It's allow you to cut parts of your fly without cutting the whole thing. Most of the scissors on the market are what we call serrated. It's kind of like your saw. There's little grooves in here, and what they do is they keep your materials from sliding out, especially on slippery materials like nylons, some of the hair materials. Some of the more common brands have Dr. Slick, which is basically refurbished surgical tools, a little bit better surgical tools than some of the other companies on the market. This is a good general purpose, heavier scissor. Scissors have been around for years as a Thompson ICE, one of the original serrated fly tying scissors. One nice thing about this, especially for the tyer with large hands or small hands, these finger loops can be bent and adjusted to fit your fingers. So you can leave your scissors on your hand as you're tying, which makes for quicker tying. The Griffin serrated ice scissors are pretty much the same scissor. This one here is what's called an offset scissor, which I really like. I set my hand in here, and this is real easy to hold in my hand while tying. It's the same basic blade as this scissor here. There's some curved scissors, a pair of Griffin curved scissors. And where curved scissors can come in handy is trimming like muddler heads. We want a kind of curved head on it. Or if you're into tying bass bugs or patterns like that, where you want a little curvature to the hair. They're also nice for trimming out wings on some patterns. A pair of all-around Griffin scissors, real fine-pointed, good general-purpose scissor. This is one of the few that's not serrated. It's still very sharp and seems to work pretty well. A style of scissors that's been pretty popular for years is this guy here. This one's distributed by Spirit River. It's an old knockout. It's a knockoff of the old Weiss Quick Clip, which was a sewing thread scissor. Easy to hold on your hand. Some of the most experienced commercial fly tyers in the world, they use this type of scissor and like it a lot. We have some squizzers, which are a little different scissors. They're real similar to some of the old iris scissors. This particular one here is probably one of the finest point scissors. It's really nice for small dry flies. They make a model with a little groove in it, which is great for cutting out stray hackle fibers. So here's some of our basic scissors. We need a bobbin for fly tying. What a bobbin does is hold your thread. Originally in the early days, there wasn't bobbins, and basically you had to tie your thread off at each time, hold tension on it. The bobbin life's a lot simpler. The big players on the market in the bobbin world are Griffin, Matarelli, Renzetti. So you have bobbins that are some metal tube like this. You have some bobbins that are metal tube with a ceramic insert. I like the ones with a ceramic insert just because you can't wear them out. Probably the worst thread on the bobbins is really fine thread, like 8/0 or 6/0. It tends to cut into bobbins a little bit quicker. The bobbins will come in different lanes. Generally, a little bit longer bobbin is easier to tie big flies with, maybe saltwater flies or streamer flies. The shorter bobbins are a little bit handier for working on small flies. There's some bobbin threaders and bobbin cleaner combinations. What we do is use this bobbin threader to thread the thread through our bobbin. You slip the end in. It's kind of like a needle thread. If you slip in your thread, pull it out. A lot of your thread's going to be wax, and so eventually you get some wax clogged up in there. You slip this end in there, and you can push out the wax to clean it out. We have some whip finishers. There's 3 basic styles of whip finishers. We got the Matarelli style, the Thompson style, and the Griffin. Advantages to the Matarelli style is you can basically whip finish the front or back of the fly. The advantage of the Thompson style is it basically controls thread tension. And the Griffin kind of falls in between. You can whip finish in a variety of spots, but it does have a thread tension spring. We have a bodkin, not to be confused with the bobbin, which is basically almost like a dissecting needle or a needle that we use for putting head cement on a fly or for picking out stray fibers, for roughing up a nymph. Have some half-hitch tools. When you first start tying, probably the easiest way to finish off a fly is to do a half-hitch. As you get more adept at it, you'll use the whip finisher there. But this is a little simpler way, and it's basically a tube with a hollow end in it, which you can wrap a half-hitch on and slide it down on the hook. And it comes with different size holes for different size hook eyes. I'll sometimes also use this as pushback deer hair on muddlers or hopper heads. Since we use a lot of hackle on our flies, we need some hackle pliers. There's a few different basic styles. There's the English style, which has been around for a lot of years. You have the teardrop style, and we have some of the newer rotating styles. All of these work pretty well. Once you find a good one, hang on to it. They can vary from model to model. So if you find one that grips your hackle well, stick with it. I kind of prefer the rotating style myself. I think it's a little bit easier to use. talked about your bodkin, but other things I'll use to put on cement or glues on flies, straight pins, toothpicks, or a Q-tip, which is disposable if you're using really sticky glue and you don't want to lie around on your bench. Kind of handy little items. For working with hair, we're going to need some hair stackers. Here's a full range of them. I have a really small one here that opens up. They use it for calf tail. Some of the finer deer hair, like on comparidons and small flies. Have some medium-sized hair stackers, kind of general purpose. This one here is adjustable, so you can adjust it for length of the hair you're going to use in it. And we've got the King Kong model, which I use for stacking a lot of hair. You know, your big sofa pillows or stacking a bunch of hair for tails. Later on in the video, we'll show you how to use those. Also, for working with hair, I got a hair packer, which I use to push back the hair on my muddler heads to make them tighter. And a bullet head tool. For tying your Matamexes and patterns like that, it'll help hold the hair in place while you wrap your thread down. When you get fancy and start getting into your Spring Creek patterns, sometimes you want some real exact mayfly wings. There's two ways to do that. We've got wing cutters, which will work like a little cookie cutter. You set the feather on a little rubber eraser and push down, and you'll see how to do that later in the video. And we've got wing burners, where you set the feather in here, take a lighter, and burn off the excess. You got a nice little mayfly wing shape. Or you can get it for stonefly or caddis wings also. You'll see dubbing later on in the video. And sometimes for making coarse bodies, a little dubbing tool is kind of handy. This particular model is called a dubbin. I think it's probably one of the easiest ones to use. Some other tools I do find handy. This little toothbrush I use for cleaning out the underfur on some of my deer hair and elk hair to make it easier to work with. Some glue bottles for putting head cement in. And just a basic inexpensive plastic glue bottle for putting drops of head cement in. This little razor box cutter knife, sometimes used for cutting materials. If you want to get fancy on your hair stuff, razor blades are kind of handy, though you have to be very careful with them. We talked about scissors earlier, and once you have a good pair of scissors, you don't want to ruin them. They can be fairly expensive, and they should last you for a long time. Sometimes we use copper wire, brass wire, gold wire for tying our flies. What we'll want is something to cut that wire with. Some electrical cutters like this work well. A couple of different types of toenail clippers work very efficiently. And probably one of my favorite tools for an all-around kind of plier cutter is these little electrical pliers. I can use them for crimping down barbs. I can crimp down lead wire. I can cut wire with it. Nice little fine tip plier. And I got a little specialty tool here. You'll see later on we're going to tie some flies. I'm going to show you some flies that actually put eyes on, especially on deer hair heads. We want to cut out eyeball sockets. And this is basically a toenail clipper. I took a drum mill tool and cut out so I can actually make a little eyeball socket if I want. Once you start accumulating hooks, a hooks box is a real handy thing. You put a bunch of hooks in there. These are curved, so you can scoop them out. You can keep your hooks organized. You can label on top what they are. And actually, you can put other materials in with your hooks that you're not using right then. Say, for example, a hackle, which I'll mention later on, so you don't lose that hackle for that size fly. One other suggestion I might make, if you're really going to get into fly tying and have a fly tying room, which makes life a lot simpler, is to get some pegboard and put it up, either on your bench or on the wall, since most things that come for fly tying are set up on Ziploc bags meant for pegboard. That makes a nice, neat, organized area. I've talked about a lot of tools, and there's a lot of dollars in tools here. But what do you really need? Basically, we need a vise. Your budget would probably determine what vise you get. What I'd say overall is get the best tools you can buy without crimping your material budget. This little Griffin vise will hold hooks very solid, as solid as a lot of the more expensive vices, although it doesn't have a lot of the extra features. If you're starting out, maybe it's better to buy some more hackle and stuff like that and have a little less expensive but serviceable vise than it is to have the fanciest vise out there. Of course, you need a good pair of scissors. Invest in one pair kind of all-around scissors, kind of a medium width scissor. You don't need the super fine points, something you can use for hair, but that you can also use for clipping fine parts on your flies. This is just a ceramic bobbin. And I'll show you in a while how to adjust one of these bobbins for thread tension. Whatever type of whip finisher works for you. And what the type of whip finisher you might get is the one that your best friend uses, because he can show you how to use it the best. He'll be the most experienced with it. Or if you take a class, it might not be a bad idea to get the whip finisher that your teacher uses, because you'll learn how to use that the best. A bodkin for putting glue on your flies and picking out the flies. I say a basic kind of all-around hair stacker's nice. A whip finisher. That realistically gets you by, although I forgot some type of clipper for your wire. Those tools will get you by. As you get more and more into it, of course, what wants and needs are always different, but you'll probably end up with accumulation of tools like this. Hopefully have a lot of fun doing it. We use tying thread in tying almost all of our flies for fishing. There's a variety of tying threads out there. There's some very, very fine threads. There's some very heavy threads. And sometimes it's kind of confusing for the beginning tyer what thread he should use. As a general rule, basically a fine thread will give you more thread wraps on the fly. It'll give you a more durable, secure fly. A heavier, coarser thread is going to allow you to compress heavy materials easier, like deer hair, elk hair. The finest thread that's commonly used is what's called spider web. It's made by Danville. There's basically two players in the fly tying thread market, Danville and then Uni products. The spider web's roughly about 20-aught. It's something you use on 28s, 24s, very small flies. It's a very delicate thread and usually only used by expert tyers. The next thread up in diameter would be the Uni thread 8-aught diameter. This is a good general purpose thread, and I use it for flies all the way from size 6 and down. I even use this particular thread on 2-aught salmon flies, Atlantic salmon flies, I should say, where I want a minimum amount of bulk. It's pretty strong for the diameter. It's usually in strength pretty close to a lot of the 6-aught threads on the market. Probably the standard in the industry for fine threads would be the Flymaster. This mics out roughly between 6 and 7-aught. Comes in some great colors. It's a flat thread. It's usually fairly heavily waxed, makes it easy to dub, and it doesn't fray. For the beginning tyer, probably the thread diameter they'll use the most will be 3-aught. It's kind of a medium diameter thread. It's a good one that allows a little room for error when you're torquing your thread, when you're tying your first woolly bugger. It's very, very heavily waxed and probably one of the easiest threads to dub onto. Uni Products also makes a 3-aught thread. It's actually slightly heavier in diameter than the Danville 3-aught thread. It works pretty well for small hoppers, some patterns we need a little bit of strength, but we don't want a lot of bulk. One of my favorite threads for big flies and smooth big heads on saltwater flies and bass flies is flat wax nylon. It's very similar to like a floss, but it's thread. It lays down real nice and flat. If you untwist your bobbin, as you're wrapping, it'll lay down completely smooth. It comes in some wonderful colors. Probably has the best color range of any of the threads I know of. Danville, a few years ago, came up with a thread that's designed primarily for flaring head. It's called Flymaster Plus. It has a little more twist to it, a little more wax. Well, wax will generally do in a lot of threads, but actually keep them from fraying. Uni thread also has their heavy thread they're using for flaring hair and tying large flies called the A+. It's A+ diameter. One type of thread that wasn't designed primarily for fly tying but works well for big bulky hair flies is rod wrapping thread. You can get an A or D diameters. It's fairly finely twisted and it'll compress hair very well. There's some newer synthetic threads that have incredible strength. One of them would be RST Dynacord. This stuff will cut your hands trying to break it. It's an excellent thread if you really, really need to compress some hair. If you have some deer hair that's very hard to work with, it works very, very well. It's a little more slippery, and it's not a bad idea to put some glue on the shank of your hook before applying this thread. Next, we'll move on to some things that are kind of associated with thread. Some of the wires, some of the tinsels we're going to use in tying. One thing I really like to use for my nymphs is copper wire. It makes a nice rib on a fly, has a little flash to it. It also makes your flies a little more durable and a little heavier. You can get this in a variety of diameters, from a small diameter, which I'll use like on 16s, 18s, 20s, all the way up to large. It should work well on big stone flies. We also now have some dyed or colored copper wires. If those of you like to tie brassies, in the past you only been able to tie them in copper. Now we can tie them in green or red. That works really well. One material that you see a lot of beginners grab out of the rack, a mistake for thread, is floss. Floss is generally used on patterns like a royal wolf. We want a smooth, shiny body. They're made of either rayon or nylon material generally. Originally they were made out of silk. That flat wax nylon I talked about earlier also works real well as a single strand floss. This heavy floss is basically 4 strands. Once you use all 4 strands on large flies, on smaller flies you may use 1 or 2 strands. On flash materials we got some of the different tinsels. Basically there's metallic tinsels and there's mylar tinsels. The best quality tinsel usually is the French tinsel, and it's actually a silver or gold tinsel that's usually lacquered over to prevent it from tarnishing. You can get this in small, medium, large, extra large diameters. Basically, you're matched up to the size of the fly. It's used as a body on a lot of your streamer patterns, or as a rib, like on a gold rib hare's ears nymph sometimes. You can get it in the smooth variety like this, or you can get the some of the embossed variety, which kind of has a minnow scale effect to it. It's basically the same material and just embossed to spread the light from it. In mylar threads, we're dealing with a plastic material. Well, the advantage of this material in a lot of cases is it doesn't corrode. It won't tarnish. If you're fishing in, say, salt or brackish water, that's definitely nice. Or if you're not real good about putting your flies away dry, it's also kind of a handy item. You can get it in red, gold, silver, pearl. Use the gold and silver, or like one side will be gold, one side will be silver, so you can reverse it. You don't need both of them. And there's some round tinsel here. This is a round pearl tinsel. The tinsel is wrapped around a thread core. It actually gives a little more segmented look to the fly. One of the better, real fine metallic tinsels I found is actually some mylar rod or sewing thread. It's really, really super fine. Makes nice ribs on small nymphs. And also I use this sometimes as the actual tying thread myself. One thing I should mention too is there's a new thread manufacturer getting in the business, Gouda Rod, which has built rod wrapping thread for quite a few years. It comes in a different style bobbin. This is actually a disposable bobbin, and it only works with their particular type of bobbin. This thread comes in 10-aught, 6-aught, a 3-aught, and an 8 diameter. The thing to remember to get the correct thread for your fly is fine thread will build up less bulk, generally make more durable flies. Heavy thread will compress heavy materials. Let's talk about hooks. Hooks are going to be the backbone of our fly. If you look out here, there's a lot of different hooks on the market. It can get pretty confusing for a beginning tyer. It can still be pretty confusing for an experienced tyer. So let's kind of run down some of the basics on hooks. Hooks are going to come in different wire diameters. Basically, a lighter wire hook's going to be better for dry flies or flies you want to float. We can go to a heavy wire hook if we want a sinking fly or a nymph. We have more mass, a little more weight. We also have more strength in the hook if we're fishing for bigger fish. Hooks come in different shank lengths. You have what we call a standard shank length, which is what we usually tie most of our dry flies on. There's longer shank lengths. Hooks that we'll use for bigger streamer flies, for larger dry flies like hoppers or dragonflies. They give you a little bit better proportion on the fly, and also put the hook further back on the fly. There's a few different brands of hooks out there. The original brand that really was big in the U.S. and still has most of the market shares, Mustad. It's a Norwegian company. Been around for quite a few years. They're one of the first ones to figure out how to make economical fly tying hooks. In the last 10 to 15 years, the Japanese have improved a lot of hook technology. Tiemco was kind of the first one to come into the U.S. in a big way. The nice thing about these Japanese hooks is they got really, really fine barbs on them, so you can crimp them down easily without breaking your hook. They have very sharp, fine points on them. They use what they call chemical sharpening. Basically, when they build a hook, when they sharpen the point, what they do is mechanically grind the tip of the hook to get the initial point on it. But to really make it fine and take out all the burrs, they basically dip them in acid, which cleans off the imperfections and makes them nice and sharp. They're basically sharper than you can sharpen yourself with a file. Also, they started using a little bit better wire than originally was used by Mustad. Mustad in the last couple of years has kind of been chased down by the Japanese and definitely improved their hook technology. The other company that's Japanese company that's a little more recent addition would be the Dairiki Hook Company, which is distributed by Dan Bailey's. It's comparable in quality to the Tiemco's, has the fine points. They have a few less models, but more than enough models for most fly tyers to use. The best way to show you the differences in these hooks and the similarities also is with this hook chart. We have different categories here. We have a dry fly, wet fly, nymph, streamer hook category. Now, the hooks aren't exactly the same in each of those categories, but from a practical standpoint, they're close enough. This hook chart can also be used to reference hooks or for patterns that you see in books or in magazines, so you can use the right comparable hook if you don't have that particular brand of hook that the fly was tied on. Best thing to do is stick with one particular brand, a few models. It's better to have more sizes than it is to have 1,000 different models of hooks. It'll make it a lot easier. You won't get skull cramps looking at your hook box trying to figure out what to use. Let's talk about chicken feathers. Hackle is one of our most important purchases in fly tying, and it can be one of the more confusing ones. Basically, you get hackle in two basic forms. You have a neck hackle, and you have a saddle hackle. And this is what the whole bird looks like when it's put together. The neck hackle generally is the smaller stuff down in here that we use for small dry flies or little teeny ones. These longer saddle hackles are used generally for larger dry flies or for wet flies. There's different types of hackle. There's what we call wet fly hackle and dry fly hackle. This hackle I have in my hand is what we consider dry fly hackle. You look at it, it has nice, stiff, shiny fibers on it. Those will help float our fly. We have some nice webby hackle, which is going to absorb water and have a lot of motion in the water. And we have some hackle that kind of falls in between. So the less expensive saddle hackles can work for big dry flies, but also work really well for larger wet flies. Hackle comes in a myriad of natural colors, but also in some dyed colors. A lot of people get really, really uptight about dyed colors, but a good well-dyed neck is great. A lot of times you get better hackle because there's different breeds of chickens who have different quality hackle. Overall, it seems like the grizzly or some of the barred necks and saddles have a little more hackle on them, a little smaller hackle, a little finer hackle. And if I can get a better color from a dyed neck, it makes more sense than to do that than go with a natural neck. There's three common brands of hackle on the market right now. One is Spencer, we have Hoffman, and we have Metz. All these hackle manufacturers are breeding what we call genetic hackle. These birds are raised for fly time, not for food. They're raised to have the best plumage on them. Have these fine, stiff hackles down in here. Gives a lot of variety of hackle sizes. Also on the market, and this has been here for a long time, are some of the Indian necks, which generally are a lot shorter, a lot larger in size. They'll get you by, but they're a lot harder to work with. What you're going to find in a hackle is good hackle will make your life a lot easier, a lot less frustrating. You'll pay a couple more dollars at the store, but you won't pay as much money at the drugstore to get rid of your headaches later on. Besides, this is actually rooster hackle on this, Besides the rooster hackle, we have hen hackle, and this is generally a wet fly situation. It's nice and webby. One thing I really like to do with this is to make hackle tip wings. We get a much broader feather than we would on a rooster neck, which makes it a lot easier for us to see the wing and for the fish to see the wing. Some of these also make very nice soft hackles, nice big webby feathers for tying soft hackles or merger patterns or making cut wings. Another common type of hackle is a Chinese neck. They're a little rounder, a little broader, and probably one of my favorite things for tying big saltwater flies, steelhead flies, or flies you want with a big, large, oversized hackle, usually wet flies. You'll find some of these strung saddles in a lot of places, which are also a good wet fly hackle. And occasionally you'll find some of the Indian strung hackle, which has some good dry fly hackle, but in limited sizes. What you'll find in a neck versus a saddle is the neck is going to give you a full size range of hackles, all the way down here from probably 28s all the way up to size 6 and larger. There's some very good saddle hackles on the market, but they'll only give you usually 3 sizes of hackle. That might be 10, 12, 14, 14, 16, 18 on this Hoffman saddle here, which is either good or bad. It's great if that's the size flies you tie in that color. It's bad if it isn't. One of the most important things to do when you're selecting hackle is to determine what color, what sizes you use in that color of hackle, and then go from there. A lot of times, for example, for me, on a brown, I'm going to tie larger flies, usually 10, 14, 16s. But on a dun hackle, when I'm tying little bluing olives, I'm going to use smaller sizes, maybe 16 and down. So you want to look accordingly at your hackle and try to find the most hackle in that size range that you want to use. That's not always necessarily the best grade. Hackle's gotten so good that even what they call grade 3, which is the lower end of the genetic hackle, is substantially better than what was around 10 years ago. How they grade the hackle is a couple different things. They're primarily grading the necks, at least, in this area from here down, which is a small hackle. The other thing they're looking for is the stiffness of the hackle, the lack of web, which is kind of that dull-colored stuff you see in here, which actually will sink a fly eventually. Some of this hackle is so good that some of it has almost no web, and even the grade 3 stuff, or the select stuff, and the Spencers will have a minimum of web, not enough to really hurt your fly. Let's talk about sizing the hackle. We mentioned sizing the hackle to get the most hackle for your dollar. There's a couple ways of doing this. You generally want to do it while the feather's on the hide. If you take the feather off, you'll guarantee you'll lose it. If you do take a feather off and don't use it right away, put it in your hook box with a corresponding size hook, and it'll be there next time you want to use it. What you need to do is take and flex the hackle. It can be real deceptive how long that hackle actually is. Technically, on dry flies, your hackle is supposed to be about 1.5 times the gap of the hook. So what I'll do there is just set my hook in the vise, flex the hackle like so, and touch the tips of the hackle to the hook shank and see how long it is proportionate to the gap. Another way of doing it is with a hook and hackle gauge. And definitely recommend a hook and hackle gauge that has the hook chart on it, because all size 10 hooks aren't always the same. So you want to reference that the hook matches up the size you're using. Take the hackle, this hooks onto your vise, and flex it around the hackle gauge, and I'll tell you what size hackle to use. Let's run through hackle color a little bit. A lot of times people ask me what color hackle they should buy. Most time people on a limited budget, so this genetic hackle is kind of expensive. They want to start out with what will get them by the best. Probably the most commonly used color, and the color I like probably the best, is grizzly. Basically barred black and white. In reality, if you had to, you could get by with that hackle alone. Has a nice buggy barred look to it. Next real commonly used hackle would be the brown. Your Royal Coachman, your Royal Wolf, a lot of your caddis patterns will have the brown in it. There's a light dun. The Western fishermen, the Pell Morning duns, probably think you're going to use this the most on. We've got a dark dun, which is more like a blue dun pattern. Ginger, ginger quill, those patterns were brown just a little bit too dark. And cream for the good old light Cahill. There's some other colors that aren't commonly called for, but can actually have really good hackle on them. One of the neatest ones is a Kreh. For those people tying your basic Adams, this is basically like having a brown and grizzly hackle together. Sometimes they're hard to come by, but if you can find a good one, grab it. You have a chocolate dun, which is a little more brown dun. A lot of times shops will have a lot of these chocolate duns just because they say chocolate dun, and the pattern book says dark dun. This is definitely a very adequate hackle. Sometimes you'll get a little bit better hackle out of it than you would in a dark dun. Some of my favorites are the barred ones. These barred gingers are beautiful. I'll use it in place of this regular ginger, or sometimes even in place of a cream. Here again, like with the grizzly, we have a buggy looking effect to it because of the variegation in it. Then we have some of the dyed feathers. The dyed blue dun is probably one of my favorites. I'll use it a lot of times in place of a regular dun. It's a lot closer to the medium blue dun that people look for but can't find. And there again, there's that buggy barred look to it. This barred brown is actually a nice color too for kind of getting that buggy look. We just want something a little bit shaggier looking than the standard brown hackle. Another thing to look for is what they call variants. What variants are is colors they can't describe normally. This isn't a dun, it isn't a grizzly. It's basically grizzly and a dun. We got two different colors of hackle on it. It's a really nice hackle, and people will pass these up. They end up being a pretty good value in a hackle. Another variant neck has some brown, some barred ginger. It's basically having two hackles in one. Got some brown hackle from brown colored flies and a ginger hackle for some light colored flies. Most of your average tyers aren't going to have all these different colors of hackle. There are some ways to kind of mix colors of hackle and get other colors. What I mean by mixing is wrapping two hackles at a time, which is going to give you a fuller dry fly anyway. For example, if I had a brown and a cream, but I didn't have a ginger and I wanted to get a ginger, what you can do is wrap one of these and one of these. Kind of like the old art class, mixing colors together to get other colors. I could actually make a light dun out of a dark dun and a cream. You can get imaginative. You don't have to be locked into certain colors. Try different stuff out, you have a lot of fun, and you may come up with some very interesting and effective patterns. There's a wide range of body materials out there on the market to tie flies with. Some of them are what we call dubbing, where we make a yarn on a thread and wrap it on a hook. Some are already pre-made yarns or chenilles that are easy to wrap on the hook. We have foams. I'll show you a few of the different things we have and try to explain their basic uses to you. One of the easiest materials for a beginner to use for a fly is called chenille. It kind of looks like a pipe cleaner without the pipe in the middle. It's got a cord in there. Comes in quite a range of colors, from these natural colors to fluorescent colors. It's most commonly used in wet flies because it does absorb water. It comes in different thicknesses. Basically have a small, a medium, and a large here. Small and this size are probably used on little flies, 12s, 14s. The medium as we get up in the 6-8 range. The large for really big flies like woolly buggers with big bodies on them. They can also be used to form a head like on a sculpin if you don't want to use a flared hair head. Real easy to work with. One good trick in dealing with it to tie it in a little bit smoother is if you take and you break off a little of the fibers here. You just have a thread to tie in instead of the whole body. Another easy-to-use material you can wrap on a hook is yarn. There's a few different types of yarn we commonly use. There's a sparkle yarn, which has fibers of antron mixed into it, kind of give it a frosted look. This is used like on LaFontaine caddis emergers. Also makes a nice body on a hopper. It can be untwisted flat to make a smooth body or twisted up to make a segmented body. This comes in limitless colors. As many colors as a sweater or a blanket can be made in is the colors we can get in yarn for fly tying, since it's basically something that comes from that industry, from the textile industry. There's a polypropylene yarn, which a lot of people like to use for bodies and for wings because it's lighter than water. A lot less dense, it's a good floating material. Usually comes in a flat, untwisted form, which is real easy to wrap. As there again, you can twist it to make it a more segmented body if you want. One of my favorite materials for making shaggy nymphs and for big leeches that's easy to use is called leech yarn or mohair yarn. It's a fuzzy yarn that can be used as a shaggy effect that you want on so many of your nymphs. Kind of gives it a lifelike look, a lot of fibers hanging off, a lot of motion in it. Some of the stuff that actually says leech yarn on it, it's the same, basically the same thing, but it comes in variegated colors. Kind of gives that nice buggy look. Material that's related to some of the chenilles and yarns is what we call ultra chenille, where actually the material is actually flocked or adhered onto a core. It's not twisted in. We can cut this and it won't fray. This is commonly used like a San Juan worm. Can make it nice extended bodies on some smaller flies if you cut it. If you heat it with a cigarette lighter or a match after you cut it, it'll actually taper the body. And this material called new dub, which is very similar to the ultra chenille, but it looks a little more like dubbing. And this is nice material if you have trouble dubbing a fly. You can wrap it on. This is actually used in the palomino midges and some of the smaller extended body flies. Makes a nice extended body mayfly in a small size. A synthetic material that's used for bodies and for ribbing bodies is called V-rib. It's basically a vinyl material. You'll see this a lot of times on big stonefly nymphs. This will be the rib. It's pretty commonly used on some midge pupas. The whole body is wrapped around, forms a nice segmented, shiny body. The other material that's very similar to that is called larva lace. And it's basically the same thing, except for it's a hollow tube. So it compresses down a little bit easier, or it can be pushed over the eye of the hook to form a real tight, small body. What can we say about the good old peacock curl? A lot of material that can be used to tie a lot of very effective flies. The renegades, the royal wolf. Lots of patterns use this peacock curl, which has a natural kind of iridescent to it. There's two forms you can get this in. We have what we call the eye, which is this here, basically off the feather. And this generally will have the fullest or the thickest hurl. It's usually up in this range, and here you find the thickest hurl. A lot of times you'll find strung hurl, where the quality can vary a bit, but it's nice and easy to use and usually very inexpensive. You'll take the chenille in most cases, especially on bigger flies, take a clump of it and actually twist it into a rope before you wrap it. Another hurl material would be ostrich hurl for making bodies out of. You'll sometimes see this used on caddis pupa as the head, especially like a little Peking caddis. Has nice little fibers hanging off the edge of it that give a lot of motion in the water. This can also be used like the gills on a mayfly nymph if you want to pull on the sides of a nymph. And it can even be used as like a marabou. That's nice, real nice soft action in the water. Pheasant tails, another type of great hurl. Most commonly used on like a pheasant tail nymph, a very effective Spring Creek small mayfly nymph. Basically just taking the fibers and wrapping it like you would on the peacock curl, wrap around the body. Here again you have small fibers that hang out and give a nice shaggy little body. One material we use quite commonly in fly tying is called dubbing. What dubbing is either synthetic or natural fibers that have been shredded up, mixed together. A lot of times you use a blender, your old coffee grinder or your regular blender. You truly have a drink called a fuzzy navel after you do that, if not careful. But you actually make this into a yarn on the hook. You take a little bit of it and you twist it on to the thread. There's different densities on this, or finenesses on this dubbing. It's the really fine dubbing, like this. It's extremely fine fiber to use on small dry flies. You could usually use it on small nymphs. This is usually some of the easiest stuff for people starting out to put onto a hook. You need to add quite a bit of it on sometimes, but it goes on very, very easily. What dubbing allows us to do by putting the yarn on the hook is to make a very, very small, thin body that can be tapered, something you can't do with yarn or some of the other materials very easily. Dubbing, like I said, comes in natural and synthetic forms. This is a synthetic here in the Hobbs Everfloat. Probably one of the better ones in the natural for fine dubbing would be like beaver or rabbit without the guard hairs in it. A lot of times we actually want coarse bodies on our flies. We want shaggy bodies. This is generally true on big stonefly nymphs or bigger flies where you want something about the bugginess, the shagginess of some flies that the fish seem to like. One material I really like is like the scintilla dubbing. There's other brands made by Wapsi. It's basically a sparkle dubbing, kind of some of that sparkle yarn I just showed you. They shredded up and made into a dubbing. You twist it up and it still has a few fibers hanging out. There's a little antron in there to kind of gather light and pick up air bubbles like a natural insect would. This comes in quite a few ranges of colors. And the natural dubbings and the coarse dubbings, probably one of the most popular is hare's ear. I got this basic old bunny face here, minus the bunny. And the reason this works so well is there's some of these coarse fibers in the center with some of the softer fibers on the outside. They'll leave a lot of shaggy ends hanging out. Basically, you automatically get legs on your nymph without putting legs on there with this particular material. This, if you're doing it on your own, you cut off, shear off, put in a blender, just take a bit, just mix it in your hand. Kind of mix the fibers together. If you're feeling a little bit too lazy to do that, don't want to have a bunch of animal parts like that lying around, you can buy pre-blended dubbing. This here is already blended together for us. A little bit easier to work with. If you make your own dubbing, what's kind of handy sometimes is mixing a little more extra rabbit in here with the hare's mask dubbing to make it softer and easier to dub on. Also in our coarse natural dubbings, we have some Angora goat. It's a coarse goat here. It's a little bit hard to dub on. Most people have a lot easier time with it if they use some dubbing wax, which is a sticky wax. Put that on your thread first and twist it on really, really hard. This is real popular like on Kaufman stoneflies. Makes a nice leech body. It's very similar in texture to the leech yarn I showed you. In fact, they can kind of be used interchangeably. This will allow a more tapered body and maybe a little bit tighter body. Material I like real well in natural dubbings also is squirrel. This is real similar to that hare's mask here, except there's more of it. I'll use this a lot of times for tails on nymphs. You can cut out the guard hairs, which are the stiff hairs. Cut up, mixed in a blender. It's used like the belly furs used in the fox squirrel nymph by Whitlock. Real common pattern, or you can buy the pre-blended squirrel and natural or dyed colors. Sometimes we'll mix some synthetics and some naturals together to get a nice effect. This material here called Hairtron. It's basically rabbit fur dubbing with antron mixed into it. The rabbit fur makes it a little bit easier to dub on. And the antron gives that frosted look. That's real common like in caddis emergers. And within the last couple of years, we have some new materials, one called Light Bright, which is basically a sparkle dubbing. It's kind of like flash blue, a crystal flash, just in a finer denier. You can actually twist and make dubbing out of it or mix it with your regular dubbing. So you end up with a real flashy little caddis pupa, some bright colored flies that will attract fish's attention in dirty water. If you want to make your flies float, what you can do is use foam. It makes them very difficult to sink. It comes in a variety of forms. The most common being a flat sheet. This particular color in blue would be a good color for a damselfly. And another type of foam you'll see a lot is insulation foam. So it's basically the same material, but sometimes you can get a few more colors. You can get grays and tans. You can actually make caddis wings out of this material if you want it. One fun material to use for bodies on flies, especially stonefly nymphs, is go raid your old wading shoes and take your laces out of them. This particular stuff makes a great extended body golden stonefly nymph, or some darker colored stuff can make a salmonfly nymph. Just take and cut it, pull out the core, and heat it up with a lighter or a match and burn the end so it doesn't fray out. Much easier than braiding a body. With the use of all these materials, you can make wild and crazy flies, use your imagination and come up with some creative, sometimes innovative and fun patterns to tie. Wing material. There's a variety of wing materials we can use for wet flies and dry flies. Let's start off with some of the more traditional materials and then expand into some of the new synthetics. One material that's been used for years, although it's somewhat difficult for the beginner to tie with, is duck quills. Patterns like black gnats and the no-hackle patterns use this material. Also very similar to that is goose quill. And I think this is a little bit easier to work with. You have the good old mottled turkey, traditional in Joe's hoppers, Dave's hoppers, most of your hopper patterns we make wings out of. Can also be used in caddis wing patterns. Get it in dyed shades, which is definitely designed for hopper wings. Nice material for thoraxes and some imitative patterns is what's called turkey flats. Wide, webby feathers we can use the wing cutter with. Which you use just like a cookie cutter or a wing burner to form a wing to a mayfly shape. You have some very traditional patterns that are tied with mallard dyed wood duck or regular wood duck. Has some nice barring in it. It's tied as a clump wing. Also can be used on the wings of traditional wet flies. One of the newer materials, at least on the American market, is what's called CDC, called the canard. These are feathers from the preening gland of a duck. There's not a lot of these on a duck, so they're fairly expensive, but they have some nice properties to them. They have the natural oils from the preening gland. They float well, and they have an animation kind of like marabou. They move a bit in the water. And for those people starting out tying, these are much easier to tie on a size 20 than deer hair is. The best stuff seems to be the natural undyed, although you can get in dyed colors. The dyeing process seems to take out some of the oil, so it doesn't float quite as well. I like using hair on a lot of my flies. Probably one of my favorite Spring Creek flies is a compared damage sparkle dun. And you want to use a fine deer hair. This is coastal deer hair. It's a little finer stems to it than regular deer hair. And it's very easy to stack and even up to make small flies. You can also get it in bleached colors. Bleached colors are a little bit easier for my blind eyes to see on the water than the natural dun color. Good material for like your royal wolves, your trudes. It's calf body hair. We also use calf tail. From the same critter, they look somewhat similar. The calf body hair is much straighter, it's easier to stack. The calf tail is coarser, has more crinkle to it, and it gives more body for the same amount of fibers. So usually I'll use this on trudes, and I'll use this on wolves. One good way to deal with calf tail, to kind of straighten it out, if you guys have dogs out there, or don't, go grab a dog brush here, take and you can comb this out, and this really evens out a lot of the hair. And after you do this, a lot of times you can stack calf tail. As with a lot of materials, there's good calf tail and bad calf tail. This one on my left hand is nice and straight, it's reasonably even, it's going to be easy to work with. This one is, you can even see from a distance, it's got a lot of curvature to it. The hair's going to be curved, it's kind of rolled around. That's going to be much more difficult to straighten out. It's going to be a bigger headache. It's not as much fun to tie with. I'll also show you a good example of good calf body and bad calf body. This is an excellent calf body hair, really, really nice and straight. This one's kind of had the bad hair day, curved in every direction. You're going to have a nightmare working with this stuff, no matter how good a tyer you are. Some of the newer synthetic materials are really, really easy to tie wings out of. Some of the yarns, the poly yarn like we're using in the body, can be combed out with your scissor tips or a comb. Forms a nice wing that's easy to see. A lot of times I'll tie my parachutes with white wings or even fluorescent wings so I can see them on the water in small sizes. Antron and Zelon are excellent for upright wings or for spinner wings. Don't need a real lot of this on there. And it's real easy to compress down on the hook, simple to work with. Material that's generally considered as a streamer material, but I've had excellent results with it on parachute patterns. It's crystal flash. It's pearl crystal flash. You can kind of see it picks up about every ray of light that comes out. It's nice winging material for some patterns like blueing olives, which always come off in horrible light and they're hard for me to see. That works really well. Makes a nice spinner wing that's easy to see. The nice thing about these synthetic wing materials is you can cut the ends off and they still look pretty good. With a natural material like this, if you trim off the ends, it looks kind of stunted. It has kind of a sterile look to it. Also, to keep me awake on blind days, get some of this glow-in-the-dark Flashaboo, which makes nice fluorescent wings. Old George Harvey's kind of the one that originated the fluorescent wing patterns. And it doesn't seem like the fish would get bothered by them. And I think a lot of times if you can see the fly, you'll get a much better drift and probably catch the fish. These good fluorescent colors like a hot pink or fluorescent orange. I'll use foam a lot of times on my hopper wings. This is a very, very thin foam I got at a craft shop. I usually either use my scissors or a wing cutter to cut out a wing. A lot of times we'll use exotic materials like double-stick carpet tape to help me attach this wing material to the fly. It keeps it from getting cut, and definitely very sticky stuff. There's some fly films or fly wing materials. They're really thin plastic. Make some neat wings for hoppers and stonefly patterns. You'll see this used on Randall Kaufman's Seducer pattern for a stonefly in different colors. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to work with than turkey wing on hoppers. You don't have to cement it or anything, just cut a wing out and lay it over. And get it in a variety of colors too. And for our dumpster hunting friend of fly tie materials, John Betts, we get Zing Wing. Clear plastic wrapping material, packing material, can make some interesting little caddis wings. You just cut it out, lay it over, takes magic marker reasonably well. We have a bunch of excess wedding dresses kicking around. It's a thing called twinkle organza. It's actually they used to make wedding dresses out of it, so it's real fine, shiny fabric. If you separate the fibers, it makes a really neat spinner wing. Or makes a good underwing on a lot of your little caddis patterns. It's something that Gary Borger found. It comes in a bunch of different colors. It's kind of fun to work with. Some of these dead bird parts will make excellent wing material for us. One of my favorite skins is actually a pheasant skin, a good old ringneck pheasant, pretty common critter. Lots of neat looking feathers on it. You can take some of these what they call church pane windows, pull one out, cement it like this. You have an excellent little wing for a hopper pattern, or even for a stonefly, nice flat wing. Imagine you get about every color imaginable on this. You can even use some of the wings for tying small muddlers. I've used some of the materials at the base here, the tail, for tying muddler patterns. That also makes great wing cases. Partridge skins, which are traditionally used for soft hackles, make excellent caddis wings. All you got to do is pull off some of the feathers, tie it in at the head of the fly, and just pull it up tight. This is what's used on Lawson's spent partridge caddis. It's really, really simple to use and has a nice mottled effect you do on a caddis wing. Back to our barnyard birds. Mrs. Chicken. We've got some hen backs and hen necks. These have nice, webby, full feathers on them. Much better to use on a wing than a rooster hackle, much less expensive to use. You can also be used with a wing cutter or wing burner. Some of these are nice and wide, and they come in about every imaginable color for tying flies out of. With all these different materials, you can definitely make quite a few different patterns. You can actually make patterns that are easy for your fish to see and patterns that are easy for you to see. And best of all, patterns that catch fish and are easy to tie. It's the Rocky and Bullwinkle Show, here to help us out with tailing materials on dry flies and wet flies. Got a piece of moose here in this hand and Mr. Squirrel over here in this hand. Tails are really important on dry flies. What they do for our flies is they balance the fly, they add support, and they act as outriggers a lot of times, help keep our fly on the surface. One of the most common natural materials is hackle fibers. There's two good places to get good hackle fibers for our dry fly tails. On a neck here, top part of Mr. Chicken, there's this area right in here, which usually isn't really great for hackling, but has very long tail fibers on it. We can separate them, pull them off, get some very nice tails. Also, this excess stuff up here that you don't generally use for dry flies can work pretty well. It's a little webby at the base, but it's long enough that we can actually not use the web part of it. The nice thing with hackle fibers, they have nice natural soft ends on them. They're not going to penetrate the water and they help balance the fly rested on top. On the saddle hackle, there's generally a few feathers right here at the top of our saddle that are a little bit longer. Here again, they're usually not great for wrapping hackles, but they're very good for tail material. And of course, we can use about any color tail we want to match any kind of pattern due to all the natural colors we have in hackle and all the dyed colors. Let's talk about hair for tails. What we want in hair for tails is stiff, fine hair. This is a piece of moose body hair. We want to get the stuff that's as straight as possible if we can. The straighter stuff's going to be easier to stack, easier to work with. Another one of my favorites is elk manes, basically elk hair from this area, from the shoulder to the neck area on a bull elk. It's really, really stiff. And what I'll do is I'll use this brownish colored hair off this for light colored hair wing flies, and this dark colored moose for dark colored hair wing flies. Sometimes we'll want a really light colored hair wing tail. You'll find some pieces of regular bull elk hair. They're a little bit finer and a little bit stiffer. The reason you want stiff hair for a tail is you have a soft hair. When you tighten your thread on it, it'll flare out, it'll bulk out. You have the spread out tail, which doesn't look very good and doesn't balance the fly as well. So it's generally going to be real, real stiff hair, really fine. Now I'll show an example of hair you don't want to use for a tail. This is some good deer body hair for flaring. When I put my thumbnail on it, press down, it spreads out. It's going to be really hard to make a nice tail. And also because it's more hollow, it's not as durable. There's less hollow hair, it's much more durable. A lot of times what I do, if I'm tying a bunch of flies, is I'll pre-stack a set of tails. Now, I'll show you this in a moment. I'll actually take a clump of these hair fibers, put them in a hair stacker, and stack about a pencil diameter worth of hairs. And I actually got enough hairs there to tie a dozen flies. This is the old Andre Pouillon's trick. I told you I'd show you how to pre-stack a set of tails. So you have some tails already ready for your hair wing flies. Got this piece of elk mane here. I'm going to cut off a fairly good clump. Clean out that underfur that's just going to get in my way. Drop this in my hair stacker by the tips. Tap it. Pull it out. Grab it. Got one loose strand there. Take my bobbin. Hold that in place and wrap around the tails. At that point, just do a few half hitches, or if you're adventurous, you can do a whip finish. Cut off the thread, put a drop of glue here. You got some natural microfibettes. One of the more popular items for tying dry fly tails, especially Spring Creek patterns, if we want really fine, spread out tails, it's called microfibettes. And originally these came from artist paintbrushes, high quality ones, but we managed to get them to the fly tying world. They come in a variety of dyed colors, all the way from clear to the dark down here. They're probably one of the easiest materials to work with for small dry flies. They split real nicely for dry flies. They're easy to tie in, and they're all even for you ahead of time. So basically for dry flies, we're looking for materials that support our fly, that are easy to tie in and don't flare. On wet flies, we're looking generally for more animation and more profile. So we're going to use some softer materials. Good old pheasant tail, which is used on a pheasant tail nymph for a variety of nymph patterns, works well. Got some soft fibers here that work great. Got Rocky the flying squirrel, which works wonderful for actually hare's ear tails, or using for tails on my yuck bugs. Got a bunch of nice even stacked guard hair basically there for us. A good old hare's mask. Guard hair fibers in here work great for hare's ear tails or other nymphs. And we have materials like rabbit fur, which you can use maybe on a leech or damselfly pattern. Good old marabou. Here for the woolly bugger, very soft, mobile pattern. Just kind of breeze in the water. And good old rubber legs. Something that just kind of wants to jiggle and wiggle, and something the fish like to eat. A profile material we use a lot on stonefly nymphs, like a prince nymphs, what we call goose biots. And basically, it's these fine fibers from the leading edge of a goose wing here, from the primary feathers. They make nice split-out antenna and tails on them. They also can be used for bodies on midges or mayfly patterns that they can be wrapped around the hook. Something that's similar to tails, but not exactly a tail, and I include in here, are shucks. You have patterns like comparadons, many of the emerger patterns, where you have a little nymph that's coming out of the water, it's halfway there, and you have the dun or the adult insect crawling out of it. So you have a little skin, kind of like when a snake sheds its skin. A lot of the synthetic fibers like Zelon and Antron, which I pretty much use interchangeably for this, collect little air bubbles and just kind of have that little bit of body there, kind of semi-translucent like that nymph skin. And generally you use these more in olives or tans or grays for those shucks. It'd be like Antron and Zelon there. So as you see, we definitely need tails on our flies, and the dry fly tail is there for balance. Our wet fly tails are generally there for animation and profile. Let's get down and dirty. When we're fishing nymphs or wet flies, we want to get the fly down to the fish's level. Mr. Trout there hanging at the bottom may not want to come up to the top and grab that fly. So we've got to get our nymph or our wet fly down to him. So let's talk about weighting flies. Of course, the most popular method of weighting flies over the years has been lead wire. It's really easy to use. Lead wire is very dense. You can wrap it around the hook shank, break it off your thumbnail. It works really well. It also comes in a lot of different diameters. The fine diameter you use on small nymphs would be a .010 diameter. A large diameter you use on big stonefly nymphs or big streamers would be an 0.35 diameter. And there's diameters in between, 0.15, 0.20, 0.25, and 0.30. With the potential ban on lead in fishing products from the EPA, we've been kind of scrambling and trying to find alternative sources. One possibility, although they're a little bit harder to work with, is some different types of wires. You have copper wire or galvanized steel wire you can get from the hardware store, which will certainly work. It's not as heavy as lead, and it's definitely a little harder to cut. If you're using these stiffer wires, what you may want to do is get a pair of pliers with cutters on them. These Xeron cutters work well. Or good old toenail clippers. Don't use your good fly tying scissors to do this, you'll ruin them. Probably the best wire alternative to the lead wire is some of the new tin alloy wires. Basically, they're like plumber's solder in finer diameters. And they're starting to be distributed in the same diameters as the lead, starting at about 0.15 and all the way up to 0.35. The thing you need to remember about these is they only weigh about 60% the weight of lead. So you may need to use more wire on there to get the same effect. Loom Products, which has some great fly fishing products, has a non-lead putty. It's basically a two-part epoxy. I'm not sure what type of metal they're mixing in with it. It's about 88% the weight of lead. It's probably the denser non-lead products. They also make a non-lead putty you can use for nymphing purposes on your leader. They should just mix together like epoxy putty, wrap it on the hook, and one neat thing you can do with it, even though it's more time-consuming, is you build up nymph body forms. You know, build a taper of a stonefly nymph out of it. You do have to wait for it to set. When you get some of these wires on smaller spools like this, the thread-sized spools, you can put them on an old fly tying bobbin, one that's maybe been frayed or cut up a little bit, or an inexpensive bobbin. And this will sometimes make it a little bit quicker for you to wrap on the hook. Probably the biggest boom in nymphs in the last few years has been bead heads. These bead heads are small metal beads you slide onto the hook shank to weight the fly. And they are what some people don't want to hear. They're basically fly rod micro jigs. There's a couple reasons these things sink well. You can get fairly good sized beads that are heavy, but also the other reason they sink well is they dive in the water. If you ever take one of these nymphs, throw it up in the air, it always lands head first. So it goes in the water with a little more velocity. These are available in a few different colors. Some colors like the gold, the silver, the copper will add a little flash to the fly. If you want a duller colored nymph, the fish are spooky in low clear water, so the black colored beads work well. On larger flies, sometimes I'll use 2 or even 3 beads. It's kind of a head and a thorax to get that fly right down the bottom. A couple important things with bead heads will make your life a little simpler. One thing, when you slip the bead on, crimp down the barb of the hook first. Try to use a hook with a fairly round bend will make things a little bit simpler. You want that countersunk bead, which is designed for fly tying, which makes it much easier to slide around the bend of the hook. Generally use larger beads on larger hooks and smaller beads on smaller hooks. Just take it, slide it in by the narrow side, and drop around the eye of the hook. Another key thing to remember is to make sure that the hole in the front isn't bigger than the eye of the hook. Otherwise you'll lose your bead right away. I'd also recommend putting a small drop of super glue after you finish your fly to secure that bead in place and keep it from twisting. If we want a lot of weight, we can add 2 beads to the hook, as I said, for a thorax and a head combination. A very popular item in, say, the saltwater and some of the streamer fishing is lead eyes. These lead eyes are little dumbbell eyes you lash onto the hook shank. And here again we kind of get the jig effect. Make the fly kind of ride like this as you move it, but then again it drops the fly head first to the bottom. We have some non-toxic tin alloy eyes, which are made of basically the same material as this non-lead wire that work well. Here again, they're 60% the weight of lead, so you may have to go up in size to compensate. Something else that will work for weight in flies too, and kind of eyes, is the bead chain eyes, like the old bead chain that you use for light switches or other items like that. Basically, you can cut them and make little dumbbells. They're not quite as heavy as the lead eyes or non-lead eyes, but you can use them on some patterns to add kind of the eye effect, like on a damselfly nymph or dragonfly nymph. They'll tend to weight the fly a little bit. When attaching lead eyes, or non-toxic dumbbell eyes, or bead chain eyes, a good trick to help secure them that Lefty Kreh showed us is to build up a couple lumps of thread, one here and one here. Put a little drop of some type of super glue in that little valley. Set our eye in there and wrap in a figure 8, both directions. And after you got a figure 8 at a few wraps in, taking a wrap underneath the eye but not around the hook shank. What that does is winches in these wraps right here. It'll help secure them on the hook. So these are some good alternatives for getting our fly down on the bottom at the fish's level. This is the Las Vegas section of our show. We've got the Vegas showgirl material here. We're going to have some flies that imitate teamboat steaks. We're going to have a lot of fun with this. We're talking about streamers. And when we're talking about streamers, it's things that imitate other minnows or bait fish that trout predate on. Actually, sometimes stoneflies and some of your bigger leech patterns will get lumped into this too. Crawdad patterns. There's a lot of fun synthetics we can play with, a lot of good natural materials. And of course, we're going to get into flash, because minnows flash. I kind of briefly run down some of the basic flash materials out on the market. Sometimes they're kind of confusing to people. The original flash material, it's made out of mylar, and most of our flash materials are mylar plastic, is Flashaboo. It's basically a flat, thin mylar fiber that has a lot of action in the water. It's going to move. The next material on the market is crystal flash. This is basically Flashaboo with a twist. This tends to be a little more of a profile material. All these materials come in a variety of colors. We can kind of match them up to imitate our bait fish. We can use them as contrast to show things up a little bit better in the water, in dirty water or off-color conditions. We have Firefly. This is very similar to flash boo, but it's embossed, like our embossed tinsel. So it has a little more minnow-scale effect. It's also a very soft material. And actually very new on the market is some of our holographic fibers. We've got holographic flash, the Spirit Rivet material. Kind of looks alive when it's sitting still. And the thinner, finer version of this is from Dan Bailey's called Brighton. These are kind of neat materials to work with. The important thing to remember with these flash materials is a little flash goes a long ways. Flash will attract and flash can distract. Like I said, in dirty water, low light conditions, you can get away with a lot of flash. In low, clear water, say fall type conditions, a little flash will do it. There's some flash body materials that are real popular to use. Ones we call mylar braid or polyflash or sparkle braid. Comes in a variety of colors to imitate different minnow bodies. Popular colors are pearl, silver, gold, copper. I like to use this gold on muddler minnows. It's a lot easier to work with than flat tinsel. You don't have to cover up as many lumps. It stretches out, fills in the lumps in the body. There's some different types of tubing. Got mylar tubing, which you basically slide over the hook. Has a minnow scale effect from the braid on it. This is a braid I bought at a craft store they use for fringe on Western outfits. It makes nice big streamer patterns. It's a material called Corsair, which Jack Gartside came up with. It makes some really, really neat extended body minnows. Usually more used in saltwater flies, but for those guys who want to chase the big trout, it can be a fun material to work with. Kind of off-the-wall material that's kind of fun to work with is this little piece of shower curtain. Kind of has that minnow scale effect. I'll sometimes use this on kiwi muddlers. Cut a strip and wrap it as the body. We have real big time fun. Go and visit the bass shops there. So these lure tapes, you can fold over and make some neat bodies or sides on flies. And we have crystal chenilles. This is real similar to regular chenille, but it's kind of like flash boo or crystal flash made into a chenille. Makes some nice bright bodies, comes in a variety of colors. There's a variety of brand names this comes in, and it comes in basically a couple different lengths. The shorter pearlescent stuff is usually called crystal chenille. The longer stuff is sometimes called a staz, ice chenille. It looks a little bit more like Easter egg grass. It's not quite as flashy. Sometimes I'll use them in combination, wrapping the shorter material as a body and the longer flash using it as a hackle. Do that on shrimp and crawdad patterns sometimes. The light bright or flashaboo dubbing can be twisted on a fly or mixed with regular dubbing to give you a nice, subtly flashy body. Sometimes I'll mix it with some leech yarn. You kind of have an underglow with that material mixed in with it. We've got a lot of neat wing material. Some of them natural, some synthetic. Some of them are going to be an action material like marabou. It's going to pulsate in the water. Some are going to be a profile material like some of the synthetic hairs or bucktail. Marabou comes in a variety of colors, a soft mobile feather. You blow on it, it moves. It works well for flies you fish at slower speeds or even dead drift. You can use it for tails like you would in a woolly bugger. Marabou muddler's a neat pattern. You can wrap it as a hackle like in a Gartside streamer. Here's a big pulsating fly. We have some grizzly marabou, which we use on smaller flies, which is some of the fluffy material from saddle hackles that's dyed. It has a barred effect like a lot of insects do. This works really nicely for damselflies, dragonflies, and crawdad patterns. Sometimes for unknown reasons, fish like bright colors. And we can get the marabou in bright colors as well as the natural colors. Rabbit fur is probably one of my favorite. These are zonker strips named after the famous zonker fly. Another animate material. use this material on my own double bunny pattern. And Jack uses this on his kiwi muddler in wider widths. You can get rabbit in strips like this, or you can get whole hides if you want to strip them out yourself or tie wider flies. Generally, what I'd recommend when selecting rabbit is I like rabbit that's fairly short myself. The longer the rabbit is, generally the harder it is going to be to sink the fly. And rabbit this length will give as much action really as rabbit this length. Be easier to throw, a little easier to work with. If you're using this rabbit for tying bunny leeches where you wrap it like a hackle, shorter hair is also a little bit easier to work with. The advantage of longer rabbit is you can cut it off and use it as a woolly bugger type tail. Here again, rabbits come in many colors, some natural, some unnatural, depending on what dye lot Mr. Rabbit fell into that day. One of the old-time favorites for streamer patterns, a lot of our eastern streamer patterns especially, is bucktail. This comes from the tail of a white-tailed deer, a buck. It's fairly fine. In longer lengths, it has pretty good action. In shorter lengths, it's more of a profile material. It's been around for a while and is available in quite a few colors. The old Mickey fin pattern is an example of this. The Clouser Minnow exceptional pattern works well with this material. Things that will help you out when selecting bucktails. Generally, the finer the hair is, the more even it is, and the least amount of curvature you have to it, the easier it will be to work with. You can stack this in the hair stacker, but just make sure you pull out all the underfur after you cut it off the hide. Some of the hair at the base of a bucktail, the coarser, more hollow hair, you can actually use for extended bodies like green drakes or damselflies or dragonfly adults. An excellent natural material has some good natural barring to it is squirrel tail. This is a fox squirrel tail. Now, a lot of our minnows have par marks on them as camouflage. Squirrel tail has it built into it already. This will work for a lot of your browner colored minnows. You can get gray squirrel for some gray colored minnows, or you can get dyed over squirrel. Has the same barring but with a little overtone of color. Or you can mix these colors together to get a light, medium, dark shade on a minnow. Woodchuck or Mr. Marmot. It's a similar barred material. It has guard hairs and a lot of underfur. So just pull out that underfur, tie in the guard hairs, and you have these nice barred tips on it. This can also be stacked in a hair stacker. A very traditional pattern for streamers is polar bear hair. There's nothing that looks exactly like polar bear. It has a certain translucent sheen to it. It's neat stuff. You don't want to buy illegal polar bear to endanger a potentially endangered species, but basically if it's in the U.S. before 1967, it's legal. Sometimes people find old bearskin rugs that somebody had for years, and they'll sell them up as fly tying material. Some materials that are actually reasonably close to polar bear, and much more available, a lot less expensive, is what we call acrylic craft fur. It's basically a synthetic acrylic fur. Has a nice sheen to it, has pretty good action in the water, it's fairly soft. It works very well on really small streamers. The old Zelon and Antron that we use for some of our dry fly and emerger patterns can be used for streamers. It's fairly soft material, has a nice mobile movement. There again, works really well on small flies. And for bigger flies, there's some big natural and synthetic materials. This material on my right hand is called Icelandic wool. It's basically from the sheep they built the Icelandic wool sweaters out of. Nice long fibers. You can make a big fly out of that if you want. Got some doll hair. Basically, it's called big fly fiber. But a lot of these materials here came from the doll industry. It's basically a fine nylon or polyester hair. Comes in long lengths. Fish hair, which is similar. You can get in different lengths and different thicknesses. It's real popular on saltwater flies, but if you want a little more sheen to a bucktail, you get with bucktail. This stuff will work. Reasonable substitute for polar bear. If you want a little minnow scale to your pattern, but you want synthetic hair, ultra hair, supreme hair, which is basically a crinkle nylon. It's like these materials here, but with a crinkle to it. Kind of like the crystal flash of streamer hair. Comes in a variety of nice colors. Sometimes I'll use this material, the ultra hair, or the fish hair, and use it for hopper legs. Got nice long fibers, and they're easy to knot to make hoppers. A new material on the market, it's called body fur. You can make some really neat big minnows out of this. It's basically a synthetic fiber, an acrylic, wound onto a string with built-in flashaboo. It can be wrapped, trimmed to shape, colored with a magic marker. Good for big minnow imitations, and real easy to work with. You could use it for the head on sculpins as well. Talking about heads on sculpins, the old traditional material is definitely deer hair. Your muddler minnow, your kiwi muddler. The head gives bulk to the fly and helps push water. What happens with a bulky fly is similar to what happens in a swimming pool. If you're underwater, you see a little kid swimming, and he doesn't make much noise. You can't hear him. The big guy jumped in, he can definitely hear it underwater. So these bulky heads on these flies definitely help out. They make commotion. Material that sinks a little bit quicker that makes nice bulky heads is lamb's wool. Basically, you adhere this to the hook just like you would deer hair. You tie it in, it flares out, you trim it to head shapes. You can mix colors on this to get mottled head colors on a sculpin. We'll include rubber legs in this section. Rubber legs are generally used more like on yuck bugs or stonefly nymphs, but it's an action material. It can be used on dry flies also, like a Madam X. It comes in different colors, about any color you can imagine. This piece here is in my hands what we call round rubber legs, which are really easy to separate. They're like a silicone rubber. We have square rubber legs, which are like a latex rubber. They're a little harder to separate, but they're a little tougher. You can use to match up the colors of the legs. You can add fibers in a wing to just kind of pulsate on the fly. Something from the bass market here is basically, it's a spandex material. They use it for jig skirts. If you want something that's a little bit finer than rubber, but very tough, you can use this as a rib or a floss even. Different brand names. Got Liflex, Lumaflex, got Hobbs Chlorophyll. It's a nice tough fiber, and it's very, very soft. Something you can use for cleaning your glasses, wiping down your car, and tying flies is chamois. There are some synthetic leathers or natural leathers. You can use them for the wing cases on stonefly nymphs. You can do crawfish patterns, some very nice leech patterns. This piece I have here is a synthetic chamois. It's fairly inexpensive to use. It takes magic marker real well so you can spot it. You got like ultra suede, which is also synthetic material. Real easy to work with. Some real natural leather chamois in dyed colors. And a material called buckskin, which is a lamb material. It's distributed. You get it in different color finishes, all the way from black to rainbow to everything in between you could imagine. One of the most apparent things on minnows, a lot of times, is their eyes. I think eyes can make a big difference on some streamer patterns, especially large ones. Eyes kind of bring the fish to life. And sometimes the predators use the eyes to figure out which way the fish is going. There's some saltwater or tropical fish species that actually have a false eye on their tail. The redfish would be one example. To kind of confuse the predator. I find I get a lot less short strikes from a double bunny pattern with an eye on the front of it. These are prism stick-on eyes, which are tape eyes. You can get them in different sizes, from very small to very large. You can get them in an opaque or in the flash colors. We can get doll eyes. This is solid plastic doll eye. It's generally more popular in bass fishing than saltwater fishing, but applicable to trout patterns as well. These come in a variety of sizes. On solid plastic eyes with stems, people get confused. They wonder how they attach them with that stem on here. What we generally do is clip off the stem, and I'll use a pair of toenail clippers just because we want to cut that really flush. We'll glue them on with like a polyurethane or vinyl adhesive like goop, Zap-A-Dap-A Goo, Aquasil. Just hold it in place. Snip. Glue it right onto the head of the fly. You have the hollow doll eyes. I like to use these more on a dry fly or floating fly, just because they're basically hollow air chambers. They rattle around a little bit, which may attract the fish from the commotion. You can burn eyes out of monofilament for nymph eyes. These are some pre-burned eyes from Umpqua. Or just take some heavy monofilament with a candle and burn it. I'm a little lazy for doing that. One of my favorite things is this hairbrush here. Got pre-burned, pre-colored monofilament eyes. I just cut them off, mash them flat, and tie them on the hook. As you can see, these streamer patterns are kind of fun to tie, get a little more creative. And it's definitely a more creative part of the sport. For me, these are probably the most fun. I tie number 16 blueing olive and throw it in the box. But one of these critters, I hang around, play with it, it's like a toy. They also can bring up some big fish. Have a good time with the streamer patterns and get creative. Old MacDonald had a fly tying room, and in his fly tying room he had a lot of hair. Hair is kind of confusing for a lot of people, and it's with most materials, especially the hair. Good material makes your life simple, bad material makes your life horrible. We're not always talking about good and bad hair, but the correct hair and the incorrect hair. The most popular hairs for fly tying are elk, deer, moose, antelope, and caribou. They're used in our western hair wing patterns. Sometimes they're used in Spring Creek emerger patterns. They have a widespread use, bass bugs. The things we want to look for in hair in general, things that will make our life easier, regardless of the type of hair, is the straighter the hair is, the easier it is to work with, especially when we're stacking. And the least amount of underfur we have in it, the better off we are. Most of our animals are going to have some underfur in there, especially animals from northern climates. Underfur is great for the animal. It keeps them warm. It's this down coat. It's this insulite pad. It's this warmness. But it's bad for us. It gets in the way. It makes it hard to stack your hair. When your thread catches on it when you're spinning hair, sometimes you break your thread. So we want to try to find the hair that has the least amount of underfur, or find hair that's easy to clean the underfur out of. Underfur is bad stuff, so how do we get rid of it? There's always going to be some underfur in our hair. We can clean it out, though. One easy way is just grab by the tip, take your fingertips, just comb it out. You're going to get rid of a lot of hair. Don't worry about it. This hair underneath is underfur or short hair that's going to get in your way. Make it hard to tie a fly. It's nice and clean now. Another possibility, to use some type of brush. An old toothbrush works pretty well. It cleans out underfur real well. So it collects in my toothbrush there. Or there's some bone combs that will work really well too. They don't pick up static electricity. But regardless of how you do it, clean out the underfur. The evenness of the hair can be helpful too. Sometimes you get a good patch of hair that's almost even, it's very easy to stack, or maybe you don't even need to stack, especially on larger flies. A lot of times we're flaring hair on flies. This happens for muddlers, it happens for hoppers, irresistible patterns. What we usually want in hair for flaring is coarse hair, hair that's very, very hollow. The smaller the fly there is, the harder it is to find hair. This happens to be a very good piece of deer hair for tying small flies with. It's really coarse right up to the tips. It's nice and even. It's going to be a pleasure to work with. On larger flies, it's not as hard to find that hair. We get this longer hair. It doesn't have to be quite as even. If it's not flareable at the tips, it doesn't really matter if I'm flaring it down here. We have natural deer hair, we have dyed deer hair. The dye jobs now are great. You can get about any color you want in deer hair. We have some hair that's dyed over natural hair, like this patch for tying hoppers, which is dyed over natural gray deer hair. I have a piece of bleached white deer hair. To get the true bright colors, you pretty much have to have bleached hair or like white belly hair. This is an example of white belly hair that's been dyed. That's where we really get the brilliant colors. And this is a piece of regular dun-colored deer hair that's been bleached to a lighter color. One thing that works really well on long pieces of hair, if you don't need the full length of the hair to tie with, just cut off about halfway down. Regardless of the hair you use, almost all of the hair down in here is extremely flareable. I'll say that sometimes for little irresistible or Goddard caddis bodies. If we want really, really hollow hair, there's two really good options. We have antelope and caribou. You can almost flare this without looking at it. It's really, really hollow. Only drawback to it's a little more fragile. And there's that kind of balance you got to use with hair. More hollow, more flotation, more fragile. Less hollow, maybe a little less flotation, but more durable. Antelope works great. I tie irresistibles with it. Sometimes I use on small muddlers, small hoppers. I'll mix it with deer hair to get combination colored heads. Caribou is probably one of the preferred materials for tying irresistibles or Goddard caddises, where you're flaring a lot of hair. What happens with these two fragile hairs is the tips don't tend to break off a lot sometimes, so they don't make as nice of a collar on a fly for like a muddler. Let's move over to Mr. Wapiti, good old elk. You get elk in a lot of different colors naturally. We have dark elk. It's about the color of deer hair, but much more durable. I like to use it for small caddis patterns. If you want to make a very durable humpy, this is a good alternative. We have lighter shades of elk, naturally. More of a light ginger colored. This is also used on an elk hair caddis, but it's a little more visible elk hair caddis. You can get some bleached elk hair. This is light all the way down the butts. This is great for extended body hoppers. We want a really light body on it, kind of a cream colored body like on a Henry's Fork hopper. And we have elk mane, a couple examples of that. Elk mane, as I talked about when we were talking about tails, comes from this area in here on the elk. It's very fine, it's not very hollow, makes extremely durable tails for harrowing dries. And of course we have dyed elk. This piece of dyed yellow elk. If you're tying extended body flies, like I said, like hoppers or some of your paradrakes, some of those patterns, this longer hair is easier to work with. Basically you have a longer piece of hair to hold on to and fold back. It also doesn't flare out as much, so it's a little easier to manage. We're back to Mr. Moose. Here's bullwinkle in a couple forms. Two pieces of body hair. We have 1/9 straight piece of body hair. It's going to be real easy to stack to make tails for our harrowing dry flies. We have a piece of curved body hair. A lot of curvature. You see that right at the tips. It's going to be very, very difficult to get even. The other piece of moose that we use a lot is the moose mane. Here again, it's from this part of the moose. This is used more for wrapping bodies, like in a mosquito. You can do a quill type body. You can also use it for antenna on flies. This isn't the super caddis from hell here, but it's an example of showing you what the flareability or lack of flareability in hair is that I told you about. I have a few different hairs all lashed in the one long shank popper hook here. Starting at the back, we have elk mane. I wrapped all these hairs with the same amount of tension on the same thread. The elk mane lies flat, it's not very hollow at all. The next piece of black hair is moose body hair, slightly more hollow. Move up to some light elk, lifts up a little bit more. Get some fine coastal deer hair, starts lifting up a little bit more. Get some coarse deer hair, which is starting to get pretty hollow. And getting more of an angle as we flare it. And we have probably one of the most flareable hairs up here, antelope. Caribou will actually be flared just like this also. Basically, this is talking, the more hollow the hair is, the easier it is to flare. The finer it is and the least hollow it is, the more durable it is. A couple important things with hooks or with checking before you tie your fly is making sure there's not imperfections in the hook. For example, this hook here is going to crimp down on the wire. There's no reason to have a beautiful fly and go fishing or take it out of your vise and have the hook break. Another thing I like to do before I tie my fly is to crimp the barb on the hook if I'm going to do it. For the same reason I check for imperfections on the hook. I want to make sure the hook's solid before I tie my fly on it. I'll briefly show you how to use the 3 basic type of whip finishers. You may want to have somebody else show you hands on hands too. It's a good thing to practice on a bare hook. We'll use the Matarelli first. Hook the thread on there, wrap around the notch, and basically roll your whip finisher around. Basically, you don't want any tension on the left hand. That's your tension hand. You want no tension at all, just the weight of the bobbin. Push straight up, I'll pop off that notch, pull straight down. On the Thompson, hook it around this notch here, slip that around that thread, hook that onto the shank of the hook, just rotate it. This is controlling the thread tension. Pop out the tip, pull up. The griffin somewhat in between. Hook around this notch, hook the thread on there, basically just rotate it around. This also controls the tension. Slip up, similar to the Matarelli, pull down. That's your three basic types of whip finishers. Bobbins can be adjusted for more or less thread tension depending on how heavy a thread or how light a thread you're using. To make them looser, with less tension, spread them. They won't hurt them. To make them tighter, pinch them together. Another way to increase more tension too is to wrap one strand of thread around the leg and then put the bobbin back in. That added quite a bit of tension there. This is a dubbing twister. We'll quickly show you how to use this style of dubbing twister. We're making a coarse body dubbing. Slip dubbing in between the loops. Basically just spin it around. And then wrap it around the hook. Or if you have a rotary vise, just turn the vise and wrap it. Hopefully throughout this video I've showed you a bit about tools and materials. There's other good sources of information out there. Friends who tie flies, fly fishing clubs, people in shops that work with tools and materials every day. When you're starting out, it's important to know the basics about fly tying. But as you become more experienced, you don't always have to tie by the book. You can be your own book. Go out there and get wild and crazy.